Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Job Hunter podcast. I'm always really excited by some of the guests who manage to get on this show. And this week is no exception, as we'll be looking at some of the research behind the potential to regrow damaged tissue and body parts in the near future. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it.
Welcome back to the Job Hunter podcast. This week we'll dip our toes into the realms of science fiction as we delve into the world of bioengineering and tissue regeneration. More specifically, looking at regrowing human cells in a lab looking at regrowing human cells in a science lab to be able to cure some of the most debilitating injuries and ailments. But instead of me rambling on about it, I thought I'd ask the experts, and on the episode today, it's my pleasure to welcome Sam Moxon.
Hiya, thanks for having me.
Sam, why don't you start off by reassuring our listeners that you aren't actually a mad scientist and maybe explain a little bit more about what you're up to now?
Okay, I'm not sure how I assure someone I'm not a mad scientist, because sometimes it can sound a bit like that. Because scientists tend to be quite passionate about what they do, and sometimes passion can be confused with madness. But basically, I am a biomedical engineer, and my focus is on trying to fix problems that usually occur with things like aging or injury when you can't recover. Obviously, if you allow me to go back to sort of fundamentals of biology, and you might remember this from school, we're built up of a collection of systems. So we have cells, and those cells come together to form a tissue, and then tissues come together to form an organ, and organs come together to form an organ system. And cells in each tissue and organ are very specific. And some of those cells have the job of repairing that tissue if it gets injured. But in some situations, injury or degeneration cannot be solved without a little boost from say, a mad scientist. And so what I'm interested in is trying to develop those technologies where people who would normally not be able to recover from either an injury or from just basically degenerate tissue, trying to give them something that allows them to recover. A good example is, as you get older, maybe your knees stop working. If we could regenerate that knee tissue, you'd be able to walk comfortably again. So I'm focusing on trying to develop those kind of technologies.
I'm not sure if that's an old person thing. I'm pretty sure my knees are gone, and I'm only 26. So maybe you can do something for me now, so I'm not going to be limping around like a crippled old person when I'm 30. But,
my ankles are terrible. So,
so you've got some vested interest here. You're kind of hoping to fix your own problems as much as everyone else's.
Yeah.
Excellent. I like to think that this might sound stupid, but I like to imagine like the human body is like a tiny little city with all these different parts making up. Like you say, like there's cells that do stuff, but then there's cells that help other cells work, isn't there? Right. So
yeah, it's a really good analogy, actually.
It must seem like there's sometimes, if your police or your fire department are underfunded and they can't work properly, then they're not going to put out the fires, are they? So that's my take on it. I'm not a biologist in any sense of the word, so I'm sure you can do a much better job at describing what goes on inside the human body. But before we get to that, I'd really love to find out more about how did you get into wanting to do stuff with the human body, and where did this interest of all things human really start?
Yeah, well, I wanted to do medicine initially. And so I chose A-levels that would allow me to do medicine. I think I chose biology and chemistry as the two that would allow me to get a med school application completed. And the other one was electronics. And I did some work experience where I went to the Royal Hallamshire Hospital, and that put me off medicine. I realised that I was still really interested in that whole process, but I didn't want to be the person in the hospital treating the patients. I was more interested in what they were actually treating the patients with and how that worked. I think if you can do a week's work experience in a hospital and still want to be a doctor, then it's definitely for you. But for me, it put me off doing that side of things. But I was just fascinated by. There was one time I sat in on a meeting where they were looking at sort of patient scans of cancers and tumours and discussing different treatment options. And I was more interested in how those treatments were developed and how they might effectively work against that tumour. And so I came back from that realising that actually I don't want to do medicine. I want to do medical science. And so I applied for a degree in medical genetics, and from that went on to a PhD. And that's when I started to develop this interest in actually we can solve a lot of these issues by engineering things that look like and behave like human tissues in the lab. So it all sparks initially from an interest in doing medicine.
So I'm not really an expert at biology at all. I was rubbish at it at school. I dropped it at the first opportunity. So why is it that cells just don't kind of do as they're told? And I know some die and kind of some replace them, but There's some cell types that don't do that at all, you know. So what is it that stops a cell from doing what it's told?
Are you happy for quite a long answer on this one?
Yeah, definitely.
So it all depends on the cell type. I mean, an example of one that is always seems to be able to regenerate itself is a skin cell. So when you get in a shower in the morning, you get washed, you get out, you dry your body, you're killing millions of skin cells when you do that just by putting pressure on them, but they're constantly able to regenerate and regrow. And so you never notice that. I mean, most of the cells in your body are really only a few years old. So you yourself, apart from a couple of key cells, are only really a few years old. So there is a natural process where tissues are supposed to be able to regenerate themselves. And some tissues are better than others. The brain, for example, is not really supposed to do that. The cells in the brain tend to live for pretty much your entire life because your memories and your functions are locked into the networks that those brain cells form. That's why when you get something like dementia and those brain cells start to die, it's just a constant process of degeneration because those cells aren't built to regenerate in that same way. The contrast is the liver, which can regenerate itself, I think maybe 2/3 of itself. So we have this process whereby if there's an injury or damage, it kickstarts a mechanism where cells are recruited and then they're told what to do. They're told how to regenerate that tissue. But that's quite sort of reliant on a blood supply because the blood supply gives the cells cues. It also brings some of the cells to that tissue to regenerate it. And some tissues don't really have that blood supply. So I talked about knees earlier. The cartilage and bone tissue in your knee has got a really poor blood supply. So over time, as the cartilage is there to give a gliding surface that when you move your joints, they don't creak, they don't hurt. But over time, that can get worn down. And because it doesn't have that good blood supply, it can't regenerate itself. And so over time, it just gets weaker and weaker until eventually the cartilage is gone and then you're down to the bone. It's the same with things like spinal discs. They have that same issue. They don't have that blood supply to be able to regenerate themselves. So that's a key factor. But also other things come into play, genetics, injuries that really damage the tissue. So it can sometimes be beyond repair. I mean, it doesn't matter how good your bones are at regenerating. If you shatter them into 1,000 pieces, it's going to be really difficult because there's no basis beyond which the cells can know how to regenerate it.
So some people are just more prone to damage, if that makes sense, not prone to injury, but like as you said, it could, genetics plays into it. If your parents and your grandparents are always knocking and bruising themselves, are you pretty much end of the road there and always going to happen to you?
I mean, I'd imagine genetics are one of many factors. I mean, if you look at the mechanisms behind some of these tissue degenerations, it's almost too complex to unpick because there's lots of different chemicals and lots of different signals from cells, lots of different proteins that are all involved in this really complex web of interactions that can, but one is perhaps used to maintain health, but also I always describe us as being sort of a system of balances. Everything in your body is designed to be in a balance. So if something goes up too much, something else is designed to bring it back down again. But it only takes one thing in a very long list of events to go wrong that can kickstart this big chain reaction that can lead to things like tissue degeneration. And genetics can be one of the factors that can influence that. It's particularly in diseases like Alzheimer's, where the brain is degenerating. Genetics can play a big role in that.
And how have we made advancements already, before we get on to what you're doing specifically, but just in our understanding of what's happening in the human body over time, and aging being an important factor? What was our knowledge, say, 50 years ago in comparison to where it is now in terms of what's happening to us?
Well, I think we're a hell of a lot further along now. Particularly, there's a couple of big advancements in the last few years that allow us to really pick apart some of these disease mechanisms. One is a group in Japan about 10 years ago produced something called an induced pluripotent stem cell. Now, what that means is basically every cell in your body started off as a stem cell, and it's kind of like the building block of your cells. And a stem cell can become any type of cell that it needs to. So if you want to study brain cells or you want to study bone cells, if you have stem cells, you can push them to become that cell type. And what was good about these kind of stem cells is normally to get human stem cells, you would have to get them from a fetus, which, as you can imagine, big ethical concerns behind that. What these researchers in Japan found is that you can take a very small piece of a person's skin, and by genetically reprogramming those cells, you can make stem cells. And if you differentiate those cells into, say, brain cells, and that patient has Alzheimer's disease, those brain cells will have the exact same problems that the brain cells in the patient has. So by doing that, you're already starting to get a more personalized understanding of how these diseases develop. So that was a really big thing, because now we can really study the very early processes of disease, but also the very early processes of how tissues are born and grow. So with every day, we learn more and more about these kind of things.
Could you use that then to predict potentially someone's problems before they happen? I think dementia is something that happens to people when they're later in life, but could you essentially map someone's life in terms of their potential medical history based on a skin cell that you've taken when they're, in their 20s?
That's part of the idea, because the problem, and I know I'm talking about dementia a bit, but I've spent a bit of time working on that, which is why it's of interest. When you make a brain cell from those cells, they are in essence still quite fetal, so they don't have some of the hallmarks of older brain cells. So we're still working out how we can study some of those diseases that maybe take decades to develop, and progress is being made on that. But what's good is a lot of these diseases, not just dementia, but other degenerative diseases like osteoarthritis or something like that, usually by the time a patient is diagnosed as having a problem, it's because the disease has progressed that much that they're getting symptoms. And so I'm a big believer in the idea that prevention is better than the cure. So the good thing about this kind of technology is you can study subtle changes at the very start of this process. And there's a recent output last year in the field of dementia research about how you could have a blood test that could pick up small changes in your blood supply that could suggest that you could go on to develop dementia. And if we could do that, we could then action something that would prevent that from happening before it's got too far. So yeah, I think that's a big side of it is studying and predicting what might happen to somebody and how you can stop it from happening.
That honestly is fascinating, and I hope that is something that is going to only grow in our understanding and implementation, and hopefully that will mean we'll have less people developing such debilitating diseases and illnesses. Yeah. Why don't we talk a bit more about what you're doing right now? So you're working, and I mean, you're focusing on tissue regeneration, but how exactly do you go about that? And I know you've told me before you were doing work with 3D printing human tissue. If you could touch on that, it'd be fantastic.
Yeah. So the broader field that I work in is called biomaterial science, and it all comes back to that hierarchy I explained with cells to tissues to organs. So every organ in your body is specific, and it's made up of specific materials. And those materials are basically within the tissue. So if you think about bone, for example, it's very stiff, very hard, because it's made of materials that make it very stiff and very hard. The brain, on the other hand, is very soft and very weak, because it's made of materials that make it soft and weak. And so throughout your body, those very specific materials are produced because the cells within that tissue are programmed within a way that they produce the right materials. Now, what we try and do in the lab is try and replicate that. So what we do is we take materials that are either the same as the one that are present in that tissue, or in some way structurally similar, and also can replicate some of the physical properties. So if we're talking about bone, we want something that's very stiff and hard. And we can make something that's essentially a three-dimensional material and embed cells within that, and they will grow throughout that structure and start to remodel it into something that is more like tissue. I mean, a good example is this is how lab-grown meat is working. They put cells into this kind of 3D environment, and they basically grow into a functional tissue that you can cook and eat. I'm not sure what I think about that myself, but that's how that works. And this kind of thing does work. There's plenty of studies where there's one came out of the University of Birmingham a couple of years ago where they essentially grew a bone in the lab. And it was in many ways resemblant of a bone. It looked like a bone. It had the stiffness. It had the cellular network of a bone. And you can see examples where these three-dimensional materials can be implanted into. A lot of it is in animals at the moment, and they actually regenerate these tissues over time. But it all comes down to making sure that you choose the right materials for your three-dimensional structure and put the right cells in there. And if I can touch on the printing as well, there's a level of complexity in these structures that's hard to replicate. So the brain, for example, is not one material with one cell type. It's multiple materials with different cell types, and they're all in very specific places. So the question is, how do you replicate that complexity? How do you ensure you've got the right cell type in the right material in the right place? And the answer is 3D printing, because you can put different cell types, different materials in very precise locations and build some of these really complex structures. And you can use those to try and regenerate something. You can use those to try and understand how diseases develop. You can even use them to screen potential new drugs. There's a company in Boston who now uses tissue engineered skin to test cosmetics, so they don't have to do animal testing anymore. So they do have real world applications.
So is the sky the limit? Will we be seeing, whole body parts and organs, hearts, whatever, being produced by this method, and potentially, save a lot of people that are waiting on very, very long transplant lists by producing these organs that are made from 3D printed tissue?
I mean, that is one of the long-term goals. The big issue that still resides in the field, and it's one that I'm sure will get solved at some point, but it takes a lot of time to try and fix it, is all the tissues in our body, with a few exceptions, have got a very vast blood supply, and that blood supply basically gives all the cells in there the fuel they need to function. The brain, again, is a perfect example. It has this really big blood supply because the cells in your brain are so functional and so hungry. They need a constant supply of oxygen, of nutrients. Otherwise, the tissue just dies. Getting that same blood supply into an artificial tissue is still difficult. And that's one of the big questions that the field is still trying to address. How do we get this blood supply, artificial blood supply, into a tissue engineered structure? And again, bioprinting is one possible way to do that, because you can place vascular cells, the cells that form the blood vessels, in specific locations. But it's still early days for trying to improve that vascularization. I mean, I think in lab-grown meat, they actually use spinach leaves, and they basically strip all the cells out of the spinach leaves, and the network that of sort of like tubules that is in the spinach leaf is what the cells grow around and form a vascular network. So there's
one thing that how do you prevent like the autoimmune response? How do you prevent it being the cells that you've grown in the lab being rejected by the person you put them in? Because the body is very good, right, at knowing when something is a foreign object, and will try to get rid of it. And do you have to constantly be taking blood out this person to be able to grow them a new ear or a new leg?
This is a good question, and actually, the key thing about what we talked about earlier, the induced pluripotent stem cells, is the idea is you would take the skin biopsy from the patient and generate the cells that patient needs from their own skin cells. So what you put back into the patient is from their own body. So it's not recognized as foreign. It is actually, you're basically putting their own cells back into them and giving it that kickstart. Because at the moment, you do have those issues, with organ donation, and also with things like, titanium implants. They can get rejected by the body. This would basically be giving the person a piece of their own body back, so there would be no issue of immune response, as long as the materials that you're also growing those cells in are innate to the immune system. And there's plenty of options for materials that are like that.
So fingers crossed, we'll get people with super soldier capabilities and whatever when they've got cells that have been grown outside and put back. But if we could touch on it, what is the actual process? If you give us a timeline of the research you're doing, like we talked about, you talk about all these interesting things with cancer patients when you went on your work placement. But what is the process of taking something, from day zero, you've got a concept, and then you start growing bits of tissue all the way through to it, successfully being put into the first person and working? And what stage are you guys at now?
So the slowest bit is always going to be clinical trials, and we're still, a little bit before that. There are therapies that are in clinical trials at the moment, so stuff constantly is going through, and a couple of products have got to market in the past that can help regenerate tissues. Although some have since been withdrawn because they weren't as effective as expected. So the process is, you start with an idea, obviously, and you develop and collect what we call preclinical data. So that's just data in the lab. Now, one of the things that's reliant on at the moment is showing that this is effective in an animal. And this is why I believe a lot of things fail clinical trials, because you try and get in an animal first, showing that it works. But animals are very, very different to humans. And so suddenly you have this drug that looks like it's a game changer in a mouse. You stick it in a person and suddenly it doesn't work. Now, the good thing about this kind of technology is it can try and improve on that testing before you go into clinical trials, because the data you'll be getting in the lab will be data on an artificial human tissue. But still, you're talking a number of years before it could even potentially be on the market, because it has to have preclinical testing. It then has to be tested in an animal. and it has to go through several phases of clinical trials. And I think there's a staggering rate of failure in clinical trials. I mean, anti-cancer drugs, I'm sure it's several hundred can go through, and only one could perhaps make it through clinical trials. But the good thing is there's a wealth of researchers out there looking to push things through clinical trials. So while it's low chance of success, it's also high input. So, but you're talking, at least maybe more than 3 or 4 years before something gets through clinical trials, because you have to gather so much evidence, which not necessarily a bad thing, before you think about putting it into a human.
So are we heading towards eternal life? Are we going to get to the point where we're so good at this, and I've just lost my foot, let's just regrow another one, kind of thing? Or is this only going to be used in certain use cases, you think, and to give people their lives back, so to speak, rather than it just being abused by the rich and the famous to give them new noses, just like that, and stuff like that? Or do you think we're heading
that's part
for
of the problem? Part of the problem is you can't really control whose hands this goes into. So ultimately, there could be something like that. The problem is, you talk about eternal life. Well, technically, we have the capacity for eternal life in us right now. Well, if you're a male, you do anyway, because in your reproductive organs, there's an enzyme called telomerase, and what you have is in your cells, you've got the DNA, which has got all your genetic material in. Either side of that DNA is a flank of repeated sequences called telomeres, and they're thought to be part of aging because they don't do anything other than protect the DNA within. Each time a cell divides, so as you get older, your cells divide, the DNA is copied into a new cell, and those telomeres get a little bit shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And it's thought that shortening of the telomeres is responsible for a lot of the effects of aging. The only place in the human body where those telomeres get longer and longer and longer is in the male reproductive organ, because telomerase is extending them. So that's why if you're a man and you're older and you have a child, you're passing on longer telomeres, they're likely to age better. So there's this weird sort of science fiction belief that if you could unlock telomerase in the body, would that stop your body from aging? Whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. But in terms of,
I was going to say that just sounds like complete. I don't know. I can't even put it into words. It sounds crazy that. I feel also slightly unfair, maybe a little bit not sexist, but I feel like biology is not being very fair there. That that men get all the potential anti-aging stuff, but I'm sure we can figure something out that the women can utilize
I think we all have the gene for it. It's just have to make sure it's just switching it on, and whether or not that's a good thing. But in terms of bioengineering and extending life, I think at the moment the focus is on improving quality of life. Not necessarily extending it, but improving the quality. Now, if we touch on things like dementia and heart disease and that kind of stuff and repairing those tissues, then obviously it could then extend life. And particularly with heart disease, which can take people in their 50s or 60s, being able to help those patients out. We're still a long way away because we can't produce full-scale organs. And to the extent of which we could push regeneration, I don't know. We're probably talking centuries ahead of where we are now. But with how fast technology moves, who knows? I mean, I know Elon Musk wants to put chips in people's brains, but from what I understand, he is really over-exaggerating his findings so far.
I was going to ask you, you're clearly an expert in what you do in medical research. Where else do you think the next big breakthrough is going to come from, aside from what you're doing?
In science or just in general?
I mean, both. Why not both? You're an expert after all.
I think battery technology is always a big one. Because obviously we're in the age where we're moving towards more electric cars, and the big issue there is still you have to sit and charge your car for 45 minutes, which doesn't really appeal when you can just put petrol in a couple of minutes. If you can be the one that cracks battery technology, then that could be a big one. And the other one is always, I think if you could cure baldness as well, you want a lot of money there, so because no one wants to go bald.
Very true, and I'm sure you put all those hair transplant sites out of business very quickly.
Definitely.
Excellent. So let's move on to the worst named part of the Job Hunter podcast, Tim's 3 Tips. The part of the show where we ask our esteemed guest, our expert guest, to answer an everyday problem. So I've just fallen over and I've just grazed my knee. It's bleeding everywhere. It's a pain in the arse. But luckily I have Sam on hand, the expert in the room. And Sam is going to give us three tips on the best way to heal a cut or a scar as quickly as you can.
Okay, well, so basically what's happening is when you cut your knee open, the first thing that happens is platelets will move into the knee and they'll cause a clot of fibrin to stop it bleeding too much, at which point skin cells will then move in, degrade the clot and replace it with new skin. And the first thing they'll put down is collagen. And if you want to improve that process, the things you need to do are things like keep it clean, so antibacterial. I think Sudocrem seems to heal everything. I nearly lost I thought I was going to lose my foot once when I burnt it, and Sudocrem just removed everything for me. Now, the problem is, if you try and push that too much and you produce too much collagen, that's when you get a scar. So one of the things you can do is something like aloe vera, which can produce and kickstart that collagen process, but then you can lead to getting quite a nasty scar. So the one thing I would like to say, and one thing that seems to be coming out, is there are now products in development that can help stop that from happening, because what happens is when there's too much collagen, it just organizes and doesn't know how to structure properly. There's now products coming to market that can actually help collagen restructure properly and prevent scarring. So my 3 tips would be: keep it clean, use something like aloe vera to help kickstart the process, and try and find some sort of anti-scarring cream to treat it with. And if all else fails, just Sudocrem. Sudocrem fixes everything. I'm sure you could lose a limb, put Sudocrem on it, and you get a new foot the next day.
It sounds like a very good idea. It sounds like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, when they just put Windex on everything.
Yeah,
Sudocrem everything. It's the cure. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure our listeners will find that very useful next time they fall over and injure themselves. But if we could, I'd love to talk a bit more about your ambitions, your career goals, and so it's kind of a double part question. But where would you like to be in 10 years' time? And then let's say when you're 80 and hopefully you get some time to yourself and retire, whatever. What would you like to leave as your mark on society when you retire?
So in 10 years' time, at the moment, I'm a postdoc, which means I've done a PhD and I'm now in the lab researching. But I'm working for somebody's research group. So the stuff I'm researching, which obviously I'm really interested in, is at the same time it's somebody else's research. And it's a key part of becoming a researcher is you need to learn how to develop ideas and that kind of thing. In 10 years' time, I'd like to be in a much more senior role. So senior academic with my own research group. And so I've got that freedom to study things that I'm really interested in, and therefore have sort of a team of PhD students, postdocs myself, who are helping to carry out that research. And if I can have that a good university like where I am now, that would be perfect. I ultimately want to have my own research group and try and have my own impact on the field. I think that'd be a good place to be. And in terms of when I'm 80, I'd like to be sat in a nice little house on the shores of Lake Windermere. I think that would be nice. And I'd like the legacy to be not just one thing, but a stream of promising scientists that have come through my research group, learned how to do research, developed their own interests, and gone off and developed their own ideas. I think that's ultimately how your career is measured in the end. It's measured on what you've done yourself, but also what you've got other people to do and how you've developed other people's careers. So I think that's what I'd like to try and do. And a Nobel Prize wouldn't go amiss as well. That'd be quite nice.
I'm sure I can put a good word in with Mr. Nobel if he was still around. But well, one thing I wanted to ask, and I do tend to ask this a lot of my guests, is do you think you need to be incredible at biology or incredible at science to be a good researcher, or do you need to be insanely intelligent or whatever? Because I feel like when you're in your teens and you're not quite sure of what you want to do or where you want to be, and there's so much pressure from society to fit in this box, so this is what you want to do. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult to actually achieve your potential. But do you think now, like looking back on it, do you think was it your innate intelligence that has really helped you along, or was it just kind of the things you've learned along the way?
I think a lot of it is stuff you learn, and to be a scientist, you just need to be able to critically think about things and respond to things. And there's a sort of a belief that A levels are the be all and end all, and really that they're not. I mean, I got a B in biology and a D in chemistry, and yet I've gone on to do a degree and do a PhD. And I think we put too much emphasis on being able to remember answers for a test. And actually, if you're a scientist, it's more important that you can think critically and react to things than it maybe remember answers from a test. I mean, it's good to have a good memory, but it's not the only thing that we need. So I think if you are genuinely interested in becoming a scientist and perhaps you didn't get the grades you wanted to at GCSE or A level, there are things you can do. There are routes you can take, whether through college or through working in a lab. You can start off as a lab assistant and then work your way up to getting certified as a scientist. There's lots of options, and I don't think you necessarily have to be, super genius to be a scientist. You need to be able to think about the work that you're doing. You also need to be able to talk to other people, because a big thing about science is knowing when you don't have the expertise and knowing when to go to somebody else. And I think it's just all about being able to work as a collective and work as an individual. And I think ultimately, if you're interested, you can probably find a way in.
If you could give kind of 16-year-old Sam some kind of comforting words or advice now, looking back on your life, before Sam had picked his A levels, what kind of stuff would you be saying to him, just to reassure him or to tell him that it's going to be all right?
Yeah, 16-year-old Sam. I tell him he needs to sort his hair out, because he used to have the really spiky all over. The first thing I tell him is that not to stress too much about A levels, because I remember at the time I didn't get the grades I wanted and I was very disappointed. Ultimately, it didn't matter in the end. And also reassure him that things turn out how he would have liked. He's got a lovely partner, a nice little pug, and they've got a nice life together. And I think the emphasis there is on having a goal and moving towards it. And as long as you do that, you can get to where you want to. So I think that's the main advice I would give him, is to have a goal, aim for it, and don't let anyone pull you back from it.
Sam, that is very, very sound advice. Probably a last question I've got for you. What advice would you give someone who wants to get into kind of medical research, and really give it a good go? What's a good place to start aside from, education, if that makes sense?
A good place to start is science communications websites. So things like New Scientist and that kind of website, they'll communicate some of the latest findings, and that can help you work out what you're interested in. And if you can sort of pin down even just a general idea of what it is you'd be interested in doing, you could probably look at what kind of researchers are pumping out that work and contact them. One of the things that's quite good about working in academia is it's a very open system. People are always willing to talk about the work. And so you might find that you find a paper particularly interesting, you email the author and they'll be happy to tell you more about it. And on top of that, a lot of these academics do public lectures as well. So attending a public lecture is a good way to try and keep that interest going as well. And just basically, I would say, you can't read too much. So that's a good place to start.
Academics are a bit like CrossFitters, aren't they? Just don't stop talking about what they do.
Yeah, basically.
Excellent. Sam, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Where can people find out more about what you're doing and if they're interested?
Yeah, well, they can follow me on Twitter. It's sorry, just breathing a little bit there. It's at Dr Sam Moxon on Twitter, and depending on when this goes out, we might have launched this in time. If not, just keep an eye out. We're starting a podcast called So-Called Scientists. Me and a couple of other friends who are also scientists in the field, talking about different technology each week. But for now, just follow me on Twitter at Dr Sam Moxon, and from there you can find links to my research and that kind of thing.
Excellent. And we shall make sure to include any links to any research as and when it comes out, ready for the episode. So it'll go in the show notes and whatever. But until then, Sam, as I said, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And
thank you for having me.
Stay safe and I look forward to seeing more of your stuff.
You too. Take care of yourself.
Thank you so much to Sam for sitting down with us today. And I definitely learned a lot about how the human body works. If you've enjoyed the episode today, why not consider giving this video a like and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification so you never miss an upload. You can follow us on all our socials, just check the links in the descriptions below. And we'll catch you in the next video, only on the Job Hunter podcast.